Barron Trump walked up to his front door after a long day, but as he reached for the handle, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carter, was struggling to carry a basket of groceries. She had dropped a few items and was bent over, trying to pick them up, her movements slow and labored. Barron immediately approached her. "Hey, can I help with that?" he asked, his voice calm but sincere. Mrs. Carter looked up in surprise, her eyes softening as she saw him. "Oh, that would be so kind," she replied, her voice tinged with gratitude. Without hesitation, Barron took the basket from her, offering her a reassuring smile. Little did he know, this small act of kindness would grow into a friendship that would change both of their lives in ways they never expected. Barron stood in the doorway, holding Mrs. Carter's basket of groceries, the weight of her unspoken loneliness settling heavily in his chest. As he helped her back to her front door, the subtle lines of age and sorrow were visible in her expression. Her smile was soft, tinged with a quiet sadness, and as she thanked him, Barron couldn't help but wonder what it must feel like to spend most of your days alone, only accompanied by the ticking of the clock and the silence that filled the spaces between. Mrs. Carter had always been the quiet neighbor, someone whose presence was there but never demanded attention. Barron, busy with his own life, had never truly noticed the isolation she carried. He'd seen her tending to her garden, walking slowly down the street, her steps deliberate as though she measured every movement carefully. But he never thought to stop, to say hello, to ask how she was. After all, his life was filled with the hustle of his day-to-day activities, work, responsibilities, his own personal world. And Mrs. Carter, despite her kind face, had seemed like just another part of the neighborhood. Yet today, something about the brief moment when their paths crossed made him pause. As she invited him inside, her voice gentle yet thick with a hint of weariness, Barron could see the toll of time in her eyes. Her husband had passed away several years ago, and though she spoke of him with fondness, it was clear that her life had been marked by the kind of silence that only loneliness could create. Barron had only known her in passing, but hearing the way she spoke of her late husband, how much she missed the days when her house was full of laughter and conversation, opened something inside him. Mrs. Carter sat him down in her cozy living room, where the smell of old books mixed with the faint scent of flowers from her garden. She spoke of her youth, of the friends she once had who had either passed away or moved far away, leaving her to navigate the quiet of each day alone. Her voice trembled slightly as she shared how much she missed the companionship of having someone to talk to, someone to share the small moments of life with, the way most people take for granted. Barron found himself listening intently, not out of obligation, but because there was something deeply sincere in the way she spoke. It wasn't just the loneliness that struck him. It was the way she had come to accept it, to carry it without complaint. Barron felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. It wasn't just sympathy he felt for Mrs. Carter. It was a sense of responsibility. He realized that for the first time, he was truly seeing her, not just as a neighbor, but as a person whose heart had carried so much for so long, silently. The realization that Mrs. Carter's world had shrunk to the walls of her home, her only solace being the plants she lovingly cared for and the occasional visit from a distant relative, made Barron uncomfortable. It wasn't right for someone to live in such isolation, to have their stories and laughter go unheard for so long. As he left that day, Barron made a quiet promise to himself. He'd check in on her more often, just to say hello, to bring some light into her days. He didn't know yet how deeply that small promise would alter his routine, how much it would change both their lives. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore the quiet desperation in her eyes, the longing for connection that she hadn't voiced, but that was so clearly there. And in that moment, Barron understood that even the smallest act of kindness, like a conversation or a simple visit, could fill the void of loneliness, bringing warmth and light back into someone's life. As days passed, Barron's visits to Mrs. Carter's home became something he looked forward to. What started as a simple gesture, checking in to see how she was doing, had blossomed into a deeper connection. At first, his visits were short, brief stops to offer help with small tasks like carrying in her groceries or fixing a light bulb that had burned out. But slowly, as the visits grew, so did their conversations. He found himself staying a little longer each time, lingering to hear her stories, to ask her more questions about her life. The more Barron listened, the more he learned about Mrs. Carter. the rich history she carried, the love she once had, and the quiet strength she had developed over the years. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter invited him inside for tea, a small gesture that spoke volumes. She had set the table with delicate china, the kind of things that she had once shared with friends and family during lively gatherings. The room, filled with the soft aroma of her freshly brewed tea, felt warmer, more inviting. Barron could sense the joy she felt in simply having someone to talk to. She smiled as she poured the tea, her hands shaking slightly, not from age, but from a gratitude she had long forgotten how to express. As they sat, Mrs. Carter began to open up more than she had before. She spoke of her youth, of the days when the house was filled with laughter and love. She told Barron about her late husband, Robert, who had been her companion through thick and thin. Her voice softened as she described how they met, at a local dance when she was just 19, how they had shared their first kiss under a starry night in the park, just like in the movies. She spoke of their shared dreams, their travels, the family they built together, and how much she missed him now. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but Barron could see the warmth in her heart as she spoke of him. He listened intently, his own heart quietly aching for the love she had lost. Through these conversations, Barron began to understand just how much Mrs. Carter had sacrificed and given up in her life. The community she had once been so active in, the charity work, the friendships, everything had slowly faded away after Robert's passing. In the years since, her life had shrunk to the walls of her house and the quiet routine of caring for her garden and books. She had withdrawn from the world, resigning herself to solitude, even though she yearned for connection. The more Barron heard, the more he understood her loneliness. Not just the isolation of living alone, but the kind of loneliness that comes from losing a partner who had been everything. He had no way of truly understanding what it felt like to lose someone so dear. But as she spoke of Robert, Barron felt the weight of it. He realized that it wasn't just about her age or the years that had passed. It was the absence of that deep, everyday companionship, the one that makes life feel alive, shared, and full of purpose. The visits continued to grow, and so did their bond. It became clear that Barron was no longer just a young neighbor doing a kind deed. He had become a true friend, a constant in Mrs. Carter's life. The simple act of showing up, of sitting with her, of listening, those small moments filled the emptiness that had lingered for so long. For Barron, he began to look forward to their time together too. Their conversations weren't filled with anything extraordinary, but there was something deeply meaningful about them, something profound in the quiet way they shared each other's worlds. Their friendship, unlikely as it was, grew stronger every day. Barron realized that in giving her his time, he was also gaining something invaluable, an understanding of the power of human connection, a lesson that had come in the most unexpected way. Barron had never known that Mrs. Carter's birthday was approaching until, during one of their afternoon visits, she casually mentioned it. Her words were soft, almost as if she hadn't realized how quickly the day was coming. "It's just another day, you know," she said, her voice carrying a quiet sense of resignation. "I haven't had much reason to celebrate in a while." The weight of those words hit Barron in a way he hadn't expected. He had learned so much from her, the way she had carried herself with grace even through the darkest times, the stories of love and loss she shared so freely. But this acknowledgement that no one was coming to celebrate her, that she had no one to mark the passing of another year with, left a knot in Barron's stomach. It wasn't just about her birthday. It was about the loneliness that had woven itself so deeply into her life, a loneliness that even time couldn't seem to heal. As Barron left her house that day, his mind raced. The idea took root in his heart like a seed. He couldn't let her spend another birthday alone, uncelebrated. He thought of all the small ways people showed love: cards, gifts, a gathering of friends to share in laughter and warmth. He knew that Mrs. Carter, despite her quiet acceptance of her situation, deserved so much more than what life had given her in recent years. Barron began secretly planning. He reached out to a few neighbors, some of whom Mrs. Carter hadn't seen in years. He asked them to gather for a small birthday celebration, one that would surprise her with love and light. Barron also picked out a small cake from the bakery, nothing extravagant, but simple and sweet, just like the gesture he was hoping to offer. He bought a card, carefully choosing one with a sentiment that felt right, something that conveyed warmth and care without being over the top. On the morning of her birthday, Barron felt the kind of anticipation that only comes from doing something kind for someone who least expects it. He went to Mrs. Carter's house, pretending it was just another casual visit. She greeted him with her usual gentle smile, unaware of the surprise that awaited her. They sat in her living room chatting quietly about the garden and the weather, when Barron suggested, "How about we take a walk outside? Get some fresh air?" Mrs. Carter, always so accommodating, agreed. Little did she know, Barron had orchestrated the whole thing. He had gathered the neighbors and arranged for them to be waiting in her front yard. As they stepped outside, Mrs. Carter froze for a moment. There, in front of her house, were the familiar faces of neighbors, some she hadn't seen in years, smiling, holding small gifts and cards. Her eyes widened in shock, and her hand flew to her mouth as her face filled with disbelief. She stood there, motionless for a heartbeat, the reality of the moment sinking in. "Surprise, Mrs. Carter," Barron said, his voice gentle but full of warmth. The neighbors cheered softly, and Mrs. Carter's hands trembled as tears welled in her eyes. She was overwhelmed with emotion, joy, surprise, gratitude, all wrapped into one moment. Barron watched as she wiped her tears, still unsure if she was truly seeing what was happening. She turned to Barron, her voice shaky as she spoke. "I never thought anyone would remember." The words came out so quietly, as if the weight of the years had buried that hope deep inside her. She pulled Barron into a tight hug, her arms shaking as she held him. "This is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me," she whispered, her gratitude radiating through her embrace. The neighbors gathered around her, sharing stories, handing her gifts, and exchanging laughs. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Carter wasn't alone. The love she had given so freely to others now surrounded her in a circle of warmth and appreciation. Barron stood off to the side, watching it unfold, knowing that this was more than just a birthday party. It was the culmination of months of connection, of being there for someone who had long been forgotten by the world. As the celebration continued, Barron felt something stir within him, something that made him realize how deeply a simple act of kindness could reach into a person's soul. Mrs. Carter's smile, her laughter, the tears in her eyes, it was all worth it. This small gesture, this moment of love, had given her a reason to celebrate again. And for Barron, that was the most beautiful gift of all. The surprise birthday party had done something remarkable for Mrs. Carter. It had reignited a light in her life that she had thought had long faded. The love and attention showered upon her that day didn't just fill her with gratitude. It gave her something deeper. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the quiet solitude she had grown accustomed to. For the first time in years, Mrs. Carter allowed herself to believe that she mattered, that people cared about her. Barron noticed the shift almost immediately. The next few weeks saw Mrs. Carter more active, more engaged with the world around her. She no longer kept to herself, wrapped in the cocoon of loneliness that had once been her only companion. Instead, she started stepping out of her house more frequently. Her garden, which had once been neglected and barren, now bloomed with life as she spent hours tending to the flowers and plants she cherished. But it wasn't just the garden that flourished. Mrs. Carter herself seemed to bloom in ways Barron hadn't anticipated. Every time Barron visited, he saw her laughing more, chatting more easily with him, and even finding joy in the little things again. One afternoon, Barron brought her a small pot of lavender from the local market, something he knew she'd appreciate. When he handed it to her, her face lit up, and for the first time, she didn't just say thank you out of politeness. There was genuine joy in her voice. "This is lovely, Barron," she said, her eyes sparkling with a kind of brightness that had been absent before. "I've always loved lavender. It reminds me of the mornings we spent in the garden when Robert was still around." Barron smiled, knowing that it wasn't just the lavender that had brightened her day. It was the gesture, the fact that she had someone who cared enough to bring her a small gift, to take a moment out of his own busy life to make hers a little brighter. The bond between them had grown into something more than just neighbors, something more than just occasional visits. They had become friends, confidants even. Mrs. Carter no longer had to carry the weight of her loneliness alone. The change wasn't just visible in Mrs. Carter. The entire neighborhood began to notice. People who had once passed by her house without a second glance now waved at her as they walked by. Neighbors who had kept to themselves began stopping to chat, offering help when she needed it, or simply checking in on her. It was as if the kindness that Barron had shown her had rippled out into the community, and the effects were far-reaching. Mrs. Carter wasn't just the lonely old woman at the end of the street anymore. She had become an integral part of the neighborhood, a person who was loved, respected, and valued. Barron had always believed in the power of kindness, but seeing its impact firsthand in Mrs. Carter's life had taught him something profound. Sometimes it wasn't the grand gestures that made the difference. It was the simple, everyday acts, the consistent kindness, the willingness to show up and be there for someone. He realized that by giving a little of his time, he had helped someone find joy again, had helped them rediscover their worth. Mrs. Carter, who had once spent her days in silence, now filled her life with laughter and conversation. And Barron, who had simply set out to be a good neighbor, found that the small acts of kindness he had shown her had, in turn, changed him too. His view of the world had shifted. He now understood more deeply how little things, small moments of care, could have an impact that lasted far longer than anyone could imagine. Through his friendship with Mrs. Carter, Barron had learned that sometimes the simplest gestures were the most transformative of all. As the weeks went by, Barron began to notice a change within himself. His visits to Mrs. Carter, once filled with simple conversations and small tasks, had evolved into something more profound. What began as an effort to help an elderly neighbor had turned into a deep connection that, in turn, shifted his own perspective on life. Barron had always been someone focused on achieving goals, climbing ladders, and keeping a tight schedule. But now, as he sat across from Mrs. Carter, listening to her stories of a life well lived and a heart that had known both love and loss, he started to see the world through her eyes. Mrs. Carter had lived a full life, one marked by resilience, loss, and deep reflection. She didn't need to speak of her struggles for Barron to understand the depth of her experiences. Her quiet strength was evident in every word, every smile, every story. Through her, Barron began to realize the value of companionship, the simple joy of having someone to share moments with, someone to listen to your thoughts and stories. It wasn't about grand moments or material things. It was about presence. One afternoon, as they sat in her cozy living room sipping tea, Mrs. Carter shared a piece of wisdom that stayed with Barron long after the conversation had ended. "Life," she said softly, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her cup, "has a way of taking things from us. People we love, opportunities we miss. But the key is to find joy in the little things, the way the sun rises, the scent of flowers, the laughter of children. Even after great loss, there is beauty to be found if we choose to see it." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that Barron couldn't ignore. He had spent so much of his life chasing after bigger and better things, always focused on what was next, always striving for the next accomplishment. But Mrs. Carter had found peace in the smallest of things. She had learned to find joy in the quiet moments, in the mundane, in the ordinary. And Barron was beginning to see the beauty in that too. As his friendship with Mrs. Carter deepened, Barron found that he was making changes in his own life. He began to slow down, to pay more attention to the people around him. He realized that his relationships with his family and friends needed more of his attention, more of his presence. Barron had always been someone who would pick up the phone for a quick call or send a text. But now, he made the effort to truly listen, to be there in ways that mattered. His conversations became more meaningful, his connections deeper. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was showing up, being present, and making people feel seen and heard. Reflecting on his friendship with Mrs. Carter, Barron was struck by how much it had changed him. What had started as a small act of kindness had turned into something transformative for both of them. Mrs. Carter had taught him the importance of resilience and the beauty of finding joy, no matter the hardships. Through her, Barron understood that sometimes the best friendships come from the most unexpected places. Their connection, built on simple moments of understanding and care, had taught him the value of relationships, the power of showing up for someone, and the incredible impact of small, everyday gestures of love. In Mrs. Carter, Barron had found not just a neighbor, but a friend, a mentor, and a reminder of the power of presence in a world that often feels too busy. As Barron reflected on everything he had learned, he knew that his life would never be the same again. Through Mrs. Carter, he had rediscovered the true meaning of connection, something that no amount of success or achievement could ever replace. As Barron's friendship with Mrs. Carter deepened, it became evident that their bond was doing something bigger than either of them had anticipated. The simple act of Barron checking in on his elderly neighbor, offering his time, and listening to her stories had sparked something in the community. Neighbors who had never exchanged more than a polite greeting began reaching out to others who might be struggling with isolation. People who once kept to themselves began to take notice of the quiet, unseen members of their neighborhood. Those who, like Mrs. Carter, were often overlooked in the busyness of life. Barron's acts of kindness had a ripple effect, reaching into every corner of the community, transforming it in ways that weren't immediately visible, but were felt in the everyday interactions between people. It was as though Barron's genuine care for Mrs. Carter had planted a seed, one that was slowly growing and changing the way everyone looked at each other. The neighborhood, once a collection of houses with no deeper connection, began to feel like a family. People would stop by to check on one another, offer help, and share their lives in a way that hadn't happened in years. It wasn't always big gestures. It was the small, consistent acts of kindness that made the difference. Mrs. Carter herself, once known for her quiet solitude, became a symbol of that transformation. No longer defined by her loneliness, she was now surrounded by a network of people who cared for her, who made the effort to spend time with her, to share stories, and to laugh with her. Barron watched as her days grew fuller. She no longer waited for the world to come to her. She actively engaged with it. And in doing so, she reminded everyone of the power of human connection, how even the smallest actions can change someone's life. Her life, which had been marked by isolation, now felt rich with purpose and belonging. Barron continued to visit Mrs. Carter regularly, his once simple gestures now a part of their routine. He would sit with her on her porch, sipping tea, talking about everything and nothing, and watching the sunsets together. Each visit deepened their bond, and Barron came to appreciate the quiet wisdom she had shared with him. Her perspective on life, how to find joy in the little things, how to cherish the connections we have, even when they feel few, had reshaped Barron's view of the world. He realized that his time with Mrs. Carter wasn't just about helping her. It was about learning from her. She had taught him something invaluable, that the power of showing up, of simply being present for someone, is one of the most profound acts of love and kindness we can offer. One evening, as they sat together on her porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began to set, Barron looked at Mrs. Carter. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an understanding that had grown over time. There were no grand speeches, no need for words. They didn't have to say anything. Everything they needed to communicate was already understood. Barron realized in that moment that the best friendships don't always come from shared interests or common backgrounds. Sometimes, the strongest connections are formed simply by being there for someone when they need you the most. And in the quiet of that sunset, Barron knew that his life had been forever changed by this unexpected friendship. Mrs. Carter, once a stranger, had become an essential part of his life, and he in turn had become a part of hers. As the evening darkened and the stars began to appear, Barron sat back, grateful. He had not only gained a friend, but had helped a community rediscover the power of kindness. And in the simplicity of those moments, Barron realized that the most beautiful transformations happen when we choose to show up for one another. As the months passed, Barron's friendship with Mrs. Carter not only flourished but became a beacon of change in their neighborhood. What had started as a simple act of kindness, helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries, had blossomed into something much more powerful. The ripple effect of their bond was unmistakable. Barron's small, consistent gestures of care had inspired those around him to do the same. People in the neighborhood who had once barely exchanged a greeting now took the time to check on each other, to offer a helping hand or a listening ear. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The neighborhood, once fragmented and quiet, had become a place where people truly looked out for one another, where a sense of community thrived in ways it never had before. Barron, now deeply moved by the changes he had seen, was invited to speak at a local community event. The event was meant to honor those who had made a positive impact, and Barron's story of his friendship with Mrs. Carter had caught the attention of the organizers. When it was his turn to speak, Barron stood in front of a crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude and humility. He had never sought recognition for his actions, but the invitation felt like a beautiful reminder of how far simple acts of kindness could reach. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to show they care, Barron said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The words, simple as they were, resonated with the crowd. He looked out at the faces in front of him, people who had seen the transformation in the community, and realized that his friendship with Mrs. Carter had done something bigger than he had ever imagined. It had sparked a shift in perspective, a reminder that kindness, when shared, has the power to change lives. As Barron reflected on his journey, he couldn't help but think about how much he had grown since that first visit to Mrs. Carter's house. He had been a young man, unsure of his place in the world, focused on his own goals and ambitions. But through his time spent with Mrs. Carter, he had learned the value of human connection. He had learned that success wasn't just about accomplishments or recognition. It was about the relationships we build and the love we give. Mrs. Carter, too, had grown. No longer was she the quiet, lonely woman at the edge of the neighborhood. She had become a vibrant, cherished member of the community, her days filled with the laughter and warmth of those who cared for her. Her resilience had inspired Barron in ways he couldn't have imagined when he first met her, and together, they had become an example of how even the simplest gestures, like taking the time to listen, to show up, to be there for someone, could create lasting change. That afternoon, as Barron walked to Mrs. Carter's house, he couldn't help but smile. He had become part of her world, and she had become part of his. Their friendship had grown into something profound, a connection that neither of them had expected but both treasured deeply. It wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about the shared moments of understanding, the quiet companionship, and the love that grew between them over time. Barron knew, as he knocked on Mrs. Carter's door, that their bond would continue to thrive. No longer just a neighbor, no longer just someone offering a hand. Barron had become a part of Mrs. Carter's life in a way that would last a lifetime. And as they sat together sipping tea and watching the sunset, Barron realized that the greatest gift he had received from their friendship wasn't just the chance to help. It was the reminder of the incredible power of a kind heart and the lasting impact of the connections we make, often when we least expect them. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the power of kindness and human connection. Have you ever made a difference in someone's life with a simple act of compassion? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who could use some inspiration, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories. Let's continue spreading kindness, one small act at a time.